Hello and welcome to another episode of Chris's Corner. You're with Pastor Chris, and I am quite excited because I get to have my mate Pastor Darrol on with me tonight. G'day, Pastor Darrol.
G'day, Pastor Chris. How are you going? Good to be on.
Really good, and thank you for joining me. And have been really looking forward to having this chat with you. For anybody that doesn't know, Pastor Darrol Mullany is the senior minister of Sound City Church, a church I go to as well. Great church. And we're going to have a discussion tonight about the wonderful sermon Pastor Darrol preached yesterday. I really enjoyed the sermon. It was called The Dilemma in the Last Days. Did I get that right, Pastor D?
That was it, yes.
And we were talking about that particular topic and, pretty much how relevant it is to the day and the time that we're living in. Would you like to give us a little quick outline of, what it was about and why you felt it was important that you shared it? And we can just go from there if that's okay.
Yeah, well, I suppose, I'm always trying to be conscious of what's going on in the world and what's happening. And when I look around and I see everything that's going on, and I suppose I'm always interested in last times and what does that mean, where we're up to. And my joke is always that I'm not sure if we're at the beginning of the end or the end of the beginning, but I just think we've got to be close. And, when I was reading this passage out of 2 Timothy, I just realized, if this doesn't summarize the way the world is today, it's just so accurate. It's so clear. And I understand that, from the beginning of Christ, it's been the end days, but, everything is escalating just a bit like everything else in what the Bible talks about that would happen in the last days. We're certainly seeing an escalation of everything. So,
yeah. And when you went into the actual sermon itself, you spoke about, like at the very beginning, where you spoke about, like in the last days, people would be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud. Can you unpack that for a little bit, just on what you discussed and kind of why you wanted to bring that out as a sermon, if that's okay?
Yeah, well, in the sermon, I focused mainly on lovers of themselves and lovers of money.
Sure.
But really, I think as I looked at it, that lovers of self, everything else comes out of that. Talk about, if you're a lover of self, obviously, it's a bit like, again, I said in my message, the difference between lust and love, especially godly love. Lust is what's in it for me. What can I get? And it's always looking at what benefits me. I think the number one question people are always asking, what do I get out of this? How does this help me? And that's really a lust thing. And that's really what happens. And I think out of that, we become lovers of money. We become boastful. And, when I talked a little bit about, trying to keep up with the Joneses. But I'm always aware, people love to boast and brag these days about what they've done and what they've got and what they've achieved. And that's really, in a sense, comes out of look at me. It's a lover of me. And it's boastful, proud, in the sense abusive, because you have a overinflated opinion about yourself, I think. So it is, you hate anyone arguing, or you don't want people to put you down or whatever. Disobedient to parents. And we're the saddest thing is we're seeing that in this younger generation. And absolutely. Where they almost are self-centered and entitled, I think the word is. They think they need everything and they demand everything, and get very upset, when parents don't do what they want. I want the latest pair of Nikes. I want the latest iPhone, or whatever that is. People, especially young people, become very disobedient, ungrateful. I think we live in a world, again, that, as I say, it all flows out of that. When you've got this love for self or lust for self almost, people are never satisfied. It's so like, it doesn't matter what you have, they want more. They want the next. And, it probably doesn't help that with everything especially with technology these days.
Yeah.
You know, as soon as you buy a computer, it's outdated. The minute you buy a new phone, it's the next one's there. But probably, if I can, just for a minute, because you know, one of the things that I've discovered, or one of the things that I understand, is that, you know, when you're ungrateful, you rarely live in a world or with an attitude of, you know, I'm never satisfied. I'm not happy with what I'm got. And I think as Christians, especially, we really need to learn to have an attitude of gratitude. You know, Paul also talks about being content with what you've got. And when you have this ungrateful love of self, love of money, you're always, you know, you're never satisfied with what you've got. And so you're always chasing the next thing. And I think there's something powerful about learning to be grateful for what we've got and where we're at right now. You know, you might not have everything. You might not have the best car. You might not have the biggest house. But, hey, let's develop an attitude of gratitude that says, God, I thank you for what you've given me. Absolutely. And I think when we're grateful for things, we attract those other things, because I think God does like to bless. And, you know, I think when you're faithful in the little things, God will make you faithful in more. And that's probably in ministry and lots of different things.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But I just think we live in such an ungrateful world. It doesn't matter what people have, they want more. And, you know, and then unfortunately, because of that, unholy. You know, I said in my sermon, but, you know, even to the point where when people don't get what they want, they start blaming God and start getting angry with God and getting upset with God. You know, I wanted this and I wanted to be blessed with that, and I want a new car or whatever it is. And we literally become unholy. And, you know, in that sense, holy is being separated unto God, but we still sort of want to live on the fence and, you know, sit on the fence and be in the world, but still, you know, still have 1 foot one side, 1 foot the other side. And I think that's all out of self-loving and, you know, just self-loathing or self-centeredness, that we become very unholy without love. You know, Matthew talks about in the last days, people are going to be so easily offended. And, you know, it's almost like and what that develops, and what Matthew talks about, is that we end up hating one another. We end up, you know, arguing, and we just don't have love. Because the biblical word love, or the biblical agape love, is always other people centered. It's always reaching out to others. But when it's all about look at me, you know, then it becomes very difficult, because without love. And I think, you know, especially for us as believers, and again, I mentioned it in my sermon. If we're going to fulfill the Great Commission, if we're going to fulfill the Great Commandment, man, we've got to be other people centered. But when you're self-centered, it's all, your world revolves around you, doesn't it? So
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, for me, I think that when a person can get to a point where they start realizing the value in what Paul's, I mean, I can't put it any better than Paul the Apostle. Godliness with contentment is great gain. You know, like, it literally is when you can kind of get past that point of just focusing on your own self and what you want or what you think you should have, and stop acting with an entitled attitude. It really brings you a lot of contentment. It brings you a lot of peace. It brings you a lot of inner peace. And it begins to, for me personally, I saw how good life can be when you have the right attitude. It just, it just makes the world of difference, you know. And I just made a note as you were talking, because I think it's true. Entitlement and ungratefulness leads to being in the flesh. How can a person who's always ungrateful or is always acting entitled or with a victim mentality, how can a person like that ever know what it really means to walk in the Spirit? Because to walk in the Spirit means that you've kept it all about Him. You've kept it in Jesus, obviously. You've kept it all about Jesus. And it's like, people often say, oh, I keep it all about Jesus. I always keep it all about Jesus. But what about when things are going wrong? What about when things aren't going the way that you think that maybe or that you hope that they would go? That's usually the test, isn't it? That's usually the time when you start thinking. But being others focused, to me, that's the remedy. That's the remedy to to what Paul warned about. I mean, Paul told Timothy that the Spirit expressly warns. So this is obviously something that he was emphatic about, obviously something he was concerned about, as you said, because obviously he had that foresight, didn't he? He was able to see that, you know, even though your words were the church was growing, the church was sort of quite rapidly expanding, and obviously, but Paul could see something, couldn't he? Paul could see something
Yeah.
about where the church was going to end up and where the church was going to go, you know. So, but
Yeah.
I've always found this particular scripture quite interesting, and in the sense that Paul makes a comment towards the end of this passage of scripture where he talks about people who have a form of godliness, you know, and deny the power thereof. I'm interested in your thoughts on that particular part of that scripture, and then I'd like to share my own. What's your thoughts on what you think Paul meant by that as a warning to Timothy that we can read about in the last days today, Darrol?
Yeah, well, I think one of the dangers of Christianity, probably the dangers of marriage, in the sense of, you know, when we fall in love, that if we're not careful, we by nature become very ritualistic, and we
Wow.
just
Yes.
fall in a pattern of things. And, you know, again, for me, I think, you know, anyone that comes to church on a Sunday not expecting God to do something is really crazy. Because, you know, we should come to church with an expectation. You know, God is the Almighty God, the all-powerful. And, you know, whether it's sickness or finances or family or whatever it is, God is able to do something. But
Amen.
when we become religious in that sense and just go through the rituals and the motions, we end up with a godliness that, or as it says, you know, having a form of godliness, but we deny the power in the sense we're not expecting, because we understand faith comes by hearing. And if we don't have an expectation, and, you know, I always say, you know, Ephesians talks about, you know, I pray that we would have the eyes of our heart enlightened, that we would know the hope of our calling, the riches of our inheritance, and the great power that's available. And I think one of the saddest places to get to as a Christian is to be an unbelieving believer.
An unbelieving
I can understand
believer,
it in the world, but when you're a Christian and you're just going through the
emotions,
and sadly, you know, there's so many people, and I mean, some churches don't believe in the power of God, so they just got this form of godliness, but they're not expecting anything to change. And, you know, I often say my dad it was a terrible plaque that he had, but we always used to laugh about it, but he always thought it was good. But, you know, it said, don't expect too much and you'll never be disappointed.
Yes.
And I think there's a whole lot of Christians who just don't expect God to do anything, and so they're not disappointed, and they just end up in this ritual. There's no real change. There's no believing God. And I suppose for myself, I'm always, you know, my biggest fear is this. I would hate to stand before God one day and he goes, Darrol, there was so much more you could have had. You missed out on so much because you didn't trust me or you didn't believe me. You know, I want to believe God for everything we've got. And, you know, I want to believe God for health and healing and wholeness and finances and provision and all those things. So I would, you know, I again, if I can tell a quick story, I haven't got the time on me here, but, you know, when I was brought up in the church, and when I was probably 18, I backslid for a year and I just pretty much wiped myself out. And I came to the point where I had no money. I lost my job. I lost everything. And I was trying to pay off a car that I had a big debt on. And I really got to the point where I thought the only solution is really to end it. I've got nothing to live for. My family had sort of not disowned me, but, you know, obviously weren't real happy that I was doing what I was doing. And I can remember just getting, I almost attempted trying to commit suicide. I certainly contemplated it, but I then came to this point where I just broke down crying. And I can just remember saying, God, if you can do something better with my life, do it now, because I'm just making a mess of it. But it was really at that point I vowed, God, I don't ever want to be religious again. I don't want to just go through the motions. I want to have a vibrant relationship, with you. And so it's a bit like, if I can say this, personally, and I did say it in one of my sermons the other day, it's the same with Alison. I said, if we ever get to the point where we end up in a loveless marriage, please just go find somebody else, because I do not want you in a loveless relationship. And I think it's the same with Christ. We need to be in a vibrant relationship, and there's so much in God. I don't think God has so many good things and so many good things in store for us. I don't ever want to just become religious and go to church because it's Sunday. So
but
I think there's a lot of people that do. I think by nature we fall into that that form of godliness, isn't it?
I think that's absolutely right. And I think, it's amazing how he groups all these people together, and then right at the end talks about them having a form of godliness. So that means that the people who have a form of godliness are boastful. That means that they're also lovers of money. And that's because they're so caught up in ritualistic behaviors and just going through the motion, as you just said. There's no real love. But when you've really encountered Christ, when you really, you want to encounter him every day, you want to encounter him more and more and more. Your life with God, having godliness in your life with contentment is great gain. And absolutely is. And I really am really quite touched and blown away that you shared that with us, Darrol. Thank you. Because I know for so many people that are out there, Christians that even are living lives of quiet desperation, because they've got so caught up in the lies of thinking it's, they've got to make a name for themselves, or they've got to, get the appropriate amount of money, or they base their value on how much money they make, or what they do for a living. Nothing wrong with being an engineer or a doctor, but you shouldn't define your identity by that, and that shouldn't be, you define your identity by your relationship with Christ and the love that you can know from him every day. That's how I think we should be defining our identity. And that's the tragedy of people that are like what Paul's describing here, because he's actually not talking about the people in the world. That's the great tragedy, I think, of this scripture. He's talking about so caught up in religiosity that they're like this. They end up with, like one of the things you talked about, they're disobedient to parents. That's such like, I've met a lot of couples over the last 10 years. Maybe you have too. Sharon and I have met a lot of couples over the last 10 years. Like, what's going on with this generation? And these are good parents. These are good people asking these questions, and you think it has to be the spirit of the age. The influence that you've already spoken about, the influence on social media. How people define their identity and their values mainly by what they get from their friends on TikTok, or what they get from their friends on Instagram or Facebook. It's like, that's the definer of what values they have. And that's why you end up in a situation that we've got today. More and more good people.
I think the tragedy with
that,
I think the tragedy with that, really, I think it almost becomes like a spirit of consumerism.
Yes.
But we even see that in the church. If you can't provide what I need and you don't have it the way I like it, and the music's not right and this ain't right, I'm going to go somewhere else.
Yeah.
And so, people have just become very much, one of the things that I've discovered, and, just in traveling, and not that I've traveled a whole lot, but you go to the Philippines or Africa or India, where you see people that have nothing. Literally, they there's no social welfare. They literally have nothing. They might be living in a little hut or whatever it is, and yet they seem to be so happy and so content, because they don't have that same spirit of consumerism.
Yeah.
It's in the Western world, we're so consumed with consumerism, and we're always wanting bigger and better and more, and it is an issue. It becomes very, and then almost to the point, again, like I read in Matthew, it talks about, seek ye first the kingdom of God, but it talks about, you can't serve God and money. And if you try and do both, you end up hating one or the other. And I see that, even in the church, sometimes people get upset because God hasn't given me this, or God hasn't blessed me with that. And they don't have that attitude of gratitude, just learning to be content with what God's given us. And I think as we learn to be content and we learn to have that attitude of gratitude, God blesses us. So.
And look, you've already
thinking.
Nah, I think, well, you've already brought it out, haven't you? The kind of end result, right? That young people are going to end up with if they follow the way of consumerism, and they define their value by their money or their clothing or material things. It's like you know what the end result's going to be, because there's nothing that satisfies the spirit. There's nothing that satisfies the heart in that lifestyle. There's nothing. There's nothing there that's going to satisfy them. And I think, again, that's the tragedy of it, especially when you see that, sadly, it has crept into some of the churches today, this consumerism mentality. It's like that's what Lucina has said, and I think she's right. There is, in some places, consumerism has crept into the church, and I think that that's an important distinction to draw out, because this is what Paul was warning about, is that, it can happen even in the church, and it's a great tragedy, I think, when it does actually occur, so and
I'm horrified how young people, how it affects young people today. They want the latest Nikes and the latest this and the latest that. Even young 10-year-old kids are throwing tantrums because they don't get the latest and the greatest. And why can't I have this? And almost that sense of privilege and or entitlement. They want it all, but it's a spirit of the age, really, isn't it? So
it is. It absolutely is. I mean, it then goes into having the latest and greatest and best house they can get, right?
Yeah.
Saddle themselves up with so much debt, like I think that's part of that too. Most people's first home, 20, 30, maybe at least 30 years, Darrol, certainly wasn't 5-bedroom, 2-bathroom, was it?
No.
It wasn't like near the beach or
first house we bought. We got as big as we could for the money we could, but it was only a small house. And we basically said, we will do, we don't want painting, we don't want landscaping. And we just bought what we could afford, did it up. 5 or 10 years later, we sold that, bought something a little bit bigger. Now, I'm 60 now, and we live on a farm, and we've been really blessed. But I didn't, I see these young kids today, they go out and they buy the latest house and the latest car and the latest television. And I think, the world is so geared up, for marketing and everything. But, it's a bit like I say, you walk into a car yard and they go, mate, hey, we'll look after you. Just put it on credit. We'll give you the latest car. And you walk into, a Harvey Norman and, hey, we'll give you the latest fridge and the latest lounge suite, whatever you want. Just put it on credit. It'll all be okay. We can give you these terms. And young people are under so much credit stress today. It's just incredible. So, and that's, they just almost feel that I don't know why. I think, probably you're probably a little bit younger than me, Chris, but, we sort of grew up in that age where we sort of started a bit smaller and we're grateful for what we had and expanded and built. And but, these days they want to start with it all. And so
they want to, absolutely. I think that, the thing about this, I think you said too, didn't you? You said that we're living in a day and an age where I think you quoted a statistic from the WHO, wasn't it, Darrol, about how many people are actually committing suicide every year. It's shocking. The amount of people. Wasn't it something like 720,000?
Every year will commit suicide. So
it just goes to show the amount of stress that are on people today trying to keep up with the Joneses, as you put it. There is a lot of pressure on people today trying to satisfy that hunger with material things. It's never going to satisfy them. It's just never going to be satisfied, is it? Living in that constant way of I want this and I want that. It never brings you to a good place. You know what I mean? It never.
And I think one of the things that escalates that in Perth is the whole mining boom. People think if I just go on the mines, I can. And what they realised, everything in life, there's, if you want this, you've got to sacrifice something else. And a lot of the times, people go for big money, but sacrifice they don't. so I had a friend who said, they wanted to put a deposit on a house, and he said, Pastor, I'm going to get this job on the mines. I can earn really good money. As soon as we put a deposit on the house, I'm going to come back to Perth. And anyway, 30 years later, he's still working on the mines. But, he sits there and he tells me, I missed most of the kids' birthdays. I wasn't always there for Christmas. I missed so many events. And, he sacrificed family for finances in the end of the day. And, and we're seeing that happen over and over again. When we planted Baldivis and we were in the primary school, they said that Baldivis was really built because it was on the freeway. People could get to the airport. So the majority of people that bought there were FIFO workers.
Okay.
And yet the divorce rate in Baldivis was over 50%.
50%? Wow.
Yeah. So,
really
50% of the kids in primary schools, parents were divorced and separated. But they chased the dream. They thought, if I just earn enough money, I'll be okay. But it didn't work out that way.
I've met people over the years, right, that have got that discipline where they've actually done it for a set period of time, or they've paid off a house, but they didn't get a FIFO job and get the most expensive house they could get with the money. They got something smaller. They pay. It's not common though. It's not a common story. I've met people that have got that kind of character that can do that, but sadly, a lot of them are chasing the dollar, and it always stays that way. They chase the dollar. They're always chasing the dollar. So, we need material things, we need finances to live. But when we love money, that's when the problem begins. That's when the attitude of gratitude is not there. Then it's going to lead you.
Yeah, I think I saw it on Facebook, and I agree. A $10,000 car will get you to A to B just as quick as $100,000 car. And a $10,000, $100 watch tells the time as well as a $10,000 watch. And sometimes people spend so much money on so much stuff, and exactly. and again, I'm not against good things. I like good things,
me too.
But it's when you're doing it out of your means and living beyond your means, and always wanting the next thing. I just think that leads to all of that Paul is talking about. Lovers of himself, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive.
Yeah. And it's a culture that's become so prevalent. And there's so many things that are influencing young people to think like this, to be like this. And they think that this is the way to go, but it's absolutely not. It's absolutely not the right way to go. And so I mean, I thought it was a great message. I thought it was a very timely message. Is there anything you can think of we haven't touched on yet or covered that maybe you spoke about in your sermon? I've tried to be comprehensively cover it with you, Darrol, tonight. Is there anything else that we could
no, well, I suppose I really concluded at the end that with both the Great Commission and the Great Commandment is for us to fulfill that and be effective. We've got to be outward focused. We've got to be other people centered. Absolutely. And I think, everything Paul has described is really will sabotage the church being effective. And I think that's the devil's whole goal and the enemy's whole goal. It's the world's whole goal, the world's system and marketing. And it's always, promoting you can have the biggest and the best. But in the end, I think people become so preoccupied with stuff that we lose sight. And as I said, just for us in Rockingham, 150,000 people, and probably only 3% go to church. 3%, have some sort of a if I could say, a vibrant Christianity. That's a lot of people that need Jesus, and we're just getting on with life and keeping up with the Joneses, and we don't. We don't. I think I used that thing when Jesus went out. He had great compassion when he saw the lost and the hurting, and but that's you've got to be other people centered to have that. So it affects the way we relate to the world. It affects our effectiveness in the world. And I think probably my little catchphrase was, if we're not careful, we become insular instead of being effective. So
Well,
or influential.
I just think the way we could sum that up is selfless people are joyful people. I mean, everyone I've ever met that really loves Jesus, that likes to give, that likes to
Yeah,
serve, tend to be
yeah,
the happiest people that I've met. Like, I don't just
absolutely.
mean fleeting happiness; I mean a deep, abiding joy where they're just joyful people. It is a joyful thing to give, I think, and it's something
Yeah,
that's worth highlighting. It's when you can see. I've said this to a couple of people over the years, like a couple of pastors. I think one of the greatest joys for a pastor is when you see someone who was like new in the Lord and maybe not quite getting it yet, the importance of being selfless, and you start to see that they're getting it, and you see the
yeah.
joy that comes through serving, you see the joy that's coming to them through giving, and you start to oh, I think they're
Sorry, mate, I'm
getting
going to
it.
sneeze.
I think,
Sorry, no, I'm over it.
I
Sorry.
think I think that's I think
Yeah,
without being too simplistic, I think for a pastor that's got to be one of the most wonderful things to see as a pastor. When you can see someone growing in their faith to the point they
yeah,
want to give, they want to serve, and you can see the joy in them. And they're like,
yeah,
especially when they're starting to get it and they're starting to see,
yeah,
hey, this giving thing's not so bad. I think I'll keep doing it.
yeah.
This
Well,
serving
my
thing's not
my
so bad.
experience of 32 years of ministry is this: that that are generous with their money are usually generous with their time and their talents as well. People that are stingy with their money are usually stingy with their time and their talents as well. And so, I think there is that joy of serving and that joy of making a kingdom impact in other
Yep,
people's lives. And so, and
absolutely.
that really flows from being generous with everything we've got. So,
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. Couldn't agree more. I mean, I've only been doing this ministry caper for 6 years, and I love it, mate. Yes, it's got its tough times, and yes, it's got its price, but there's nothing better when you're doing what God wants you to do. When you're doing the very thing that God's purpose for you to do. I wouldn't change it for anything. So I just
yeah,
thought I just thought I'd share that. So
absolutely.
you
Yeah.
know what I mean? So yeah, so look, I really enjoyed the chat tonight, and I really appreciate just coming on Chris's Corner. And I just thought we could have it. When I spoke to you about what you're going to talk on, I was like, oh man, we've got to go there. Yeah, let's go there. And I thought that was a really good topic to talk about tonight. So
Beautiful.
um, yeah, well, thanks, mate. Look, I mean, I think we've covered it pretty well. But have you got any closing thoughts you want to share with us before we say goodbye, Darrol? That maybe you'd like to share just in closing.
Well, no, probably just to highlight that we are really living in, I think we're living in the last of the last days. Someone sent me a message. He said, I think we're living in the last minutes, not just the last hours.
Yep.
And we've got to be as effective as we can. If the church doesn't rise up now, Jesus didn't have a plan B. We were the only plan that he had was the church. And so I think the church needs to rise up. The church needs to be all it can be. And, if we don't realize we're living in the last days, well, then something's wrong.
Yeah,
So
exactly. If
got
not
your head
now, then
buried in the
when?
cloud somewhere. So
Yeah, exactly. I think we can be the army of the Lord with the joy of the Lord, and that's what is our strength, and that's what we're going to need in these last days, to be the army of the Lord with the joy of the Lord, because the joy of the Lord is what the joy of the Lord can carry you through anything. I really believe that with all my heart. The joy of the Lord can carry you through anything. And I think that's the thing that people need to realize more than ever. Become outward focused, become someone who keeps all about Jesus, because that's where your joy is going to come from, and that's going to hold you in good stead, especially as the last days become more and more of the last days. I could put it like that.
absolutely.
You know what I mean? So,
Yeah.
yeah, thank you, mate. Thanks, Lucina. I can see some really good comments, and I was saying to Darrol before we went live, I love to highlight the comments because it is a part of doing it live. So, thank you for tuning in, and thank you for watching.
Thanks, Lucina. Appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, all right, mate. Well, I'm just going to bring this chat to an end, this episode to an end of Chris's Corner, and I'm going to say thank you to Pastor Darrol Mullany, and thank you for coming on, and really appreciate you sharing your thoughts on an awesome sermon, which is called "The Dilemma of the Last Days." Go to YouTube, look for Sound City, and you'll find the whole sermon available there. You'll be able to watch. So, thank you, Pastor Darrol. Really appreciate you, my friend, coming on tonight.
Bless you heaps. No worries. Thank you.
Bye. Well, that was Pastor Darrol Mullany from Sound City Church talking to us about the last days dilemma, which is something that Paul wrote about to Timothy. You know, we've got to really rise up as a church, and we've got to be the army of the Lord, because the time is short. But we can be joyful about serving the Lord, because serving the Lord is a wonderful thing. Thank you for watching Chris's Corner tonight, and God bless you. Stay unique. See you next time.